Hello. You're listening to The Chronicles, the podcast of the Centre for Viking and Medieval Studies at Aarhus University. I'm Richard Cole. In the late 680s, a Christian chronicler living in Muslim-ruled Egypt recorded the name of the current pope. So far as we can see, it was the last time for the next 5 centuries that anyone in his congregation would write down the name of the pope and get it right. Such was the cultural gravity of the early medieval Islamic Caliphate, a colossal state stretching from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Indus River in the east. Arab and Persian intellectuals living in the Caliphate had good reason to believe that they were at the centre of the world. One language, Arabic, and one religion, Islam, gave them access to a vast network of peoples, places, texts, and ideas. Muslims and their non-Muslim subjects alike had little need to look beyond their own borders, as the example of our Christians who lost all knowledge of the papacy show. Yet some Muslim intellectuals in the early Middle Ages did express an interest in the various tribes who lived in the shadows of the light of Islam. From their court and libraries in Baghdad at the heart of the Caliphate, they compiled information about various peoples as far away as Central Asia, West Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and Scandinavia. One group often mentioned in the writings of Arab and Persian intellectuals were called the Rus, or in the plural, Rusia. These were the descendants of Viking-age travellers from Scandinavia who had mixed with Slavic and Turkic peoples as they travelled along the river networks of what would one day become Russia, the country to which they eventually lent their name. Joining me to talk about the interest of early medieval Muslims in the Rus is Tonicha Upham, past and present research fellow at the Institute of Historical Research, London. Welcome to Knowledge, Tonicha. I'm going to start by asking you a question that I've been asking everybody who comes on this programme. What does the Middle Ages mean to you? Is there some spirit to the Middle Ages or something that makes the period make sense?
Well, thank you very much for having me, Richard. I think that's a very broad question, and for me, the answer to what the Middle Ages means is very expansive. With what I work with in a very global Middle Ages context, I take quite a broad and catch-all approach to the Middle Ages, where I see it as quite a lengthy time period.
Could we put some dates on it?
Quite loosely defined. I would work vaguely from around the 700s, 800s, through to the 14 and 1500s, really. Obviously, that all varies depending on where you're looking at. In a Scandinavian context, especially in a Danish classroom setting, it's very difficult to say medieval to students when you're talking about something that's Viking Age or even earlier.
Yes.
And so there are obviously very distinct chronological boundaries there in terms of what people accept. But for me, what I'm looking at is I'm looking at that very broad time period of 800, 900 years even. And I'm looking at it not just in relation to Western Europe, but in relation to what these links mean across the globe. And obviously not everybody is experiencing a Middle Ages at that point. Not everybody has a time period that we call a Middle Ages, but my basis for it is essentially the more the merrier when it comes to kind of dragging in time periods and geographical regions.
Well, let's start by getting some pieces on the board. I said we'd be talking about intellectuals, and I think we'll get to what we mean by an intellectual, but we're talking about these people in the Caliphate, particularly from around the middle of the 700s to the 900s. What was the Caliphate? When I say that word, what am I talking about?
At its most basic, really what we're looking at is we're looking at the political entity as such, the empire that was the dominant force in this part of the world at that point in time.
So it begins with the direct followers of Muhammad, the Prophet?
Yes.
Yeah.
I cannot tell you who Al-Muqtada is descended from. But the Caliphate is steered by a caliph, essentially a ruler.
And he represents all Muslims.
Yes. We can see the Caliphate not simply as a political centre, but also as a cultural centre, looking to cities like Baghdad, but also other cities within the Islamic world and what it means for them to be centres of art and culture and learning. And that's especially important when we're thinking about the intellectual traditions at play. The Umayyad and then especially the Abbasid Caliphate really picked up...
These are different dynasties that ruled over the Caliphate. We start with Rashidun, then we have Umayyad, then Abbasid. Okay, carry on.
Yes. These caliphates, really intellectuals at these time periods really pulled on ancient Greek intellectual traditions. There were translation movements of ancient Greek and Latin texts into Arabic for the first time. And this really built on traditions of science and geography and history. So what we see is this real explosion of a book culture, in effect, where there are these learned men who are specialists in a huge range of different things. They're polymaths, essentially. And they go into huge amounts of detail, drawing on what they've read from ancient Greek texts and expanding it, and then working from each other's material to provide ever greater expansions of knowledge. So what was initially a translation movement then becomes this huge intellectual expansion.
And just to put some geography on this, as well as being a cultural sphere, which I think you show very well, it's also got a geographic. We could draw a map of the Caliphate, or we could try to, couldn't we? It's this territory that is a state that theoretically represents all Muslims, all the way from Morocco in the west, and then of course it gets a bit tricky once you get into Persia. But it's pushing eastwards as well, right?
Yes, and obviously there are splits at different points in time. So when the Islamic world stretches as far as Al-Andalus, that is what we know as Spain and parts of Portugal today, that then sees a different dynastic split to other parts of the Islamic world. The different parts and the huge geographic expanse brings with it different levels of tensions with the borderlands. So in the east, for instance, there are huge tensions along the border with Byzantium, and that informs an awful lot of writing about foreigners by Arab writers. It's these tensions, these concerns about the most immediate political and cultural threat to them.
And it's quite stunning as a general historical project, isn't it? You've got, towards the end of the 600s, most Christians outside of Byzantium had no idea who the Muslims really were. By the time you get to the 800s, there's this state that's got all of Northwest Africa coming up into Spain, and then is even pushing eastwards. So it's an incredible historical transformation, even when it doesn't hang together over time. Yes,
it's from the initial period of the development of the Islamic religion to the creation of this state and the caliphate as a whole. It's quite a rapid...
we're talking 50 to 100 years, really, that the explosion kind of happens. And it takes them a bit longer to get Spain, but yes. How far would it be true to say that the people of the Caliphate, or at least intellectuals in the Caliphate, the kind of people you're talking about who are reading all this Greek stuff and getting excited, how far is it true to say that they thought of faraway peoples outside the Caliphate as, I'm going to use some scary words here, barbaric, primitive, savage, or am I sort of projecting a European colonial mode of thought onto this Islamic empire? Did they think of the faraway peoples as sort of, primitive rubes, basically?
It's that's an interesting one, and it's quite a complicated one to unpick. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at geographical works written in Arabic, predominantly by Arab writers, but also by others. One of the most prominent people I work with actually came from Byzantium and was a slave before he was released, and ended up writing a huge geographical work in Arabic.
So, wow, okay. So he would have converted to Islam or...
Yes,
like that. Yeah,
yes.
Okay.
I imagine so. And these geographical works, they're dealing with the fullest extent of the world as it is understood to them. And so we see shifts even from what they're drawing on from ancient Greek texts, where they're moving the most fantastical, the most monstrous aspects of the distant geographical lands further and further north, because as more of the world becomes known to them, they kind of have to put the monsters further and further towards the edge of the map, in essence. There is a certain degree of implicit comparison in this between us and them, as it were.
Us being the Muslims,
yes.
and them being
yes, exactly. This implicit sense of what it is that's catching the interest of geographers when they're writing about these things, or they're talking about religion, they're emphasising which cultures cremate their dead, because that's seen as quite horrifying from a Muslim perspective for these geographers. And these things where they're not having to say out loud, these people are primitive, these people are savage, but the idea is this difference in development is made clear when it's emphasised that there are these lands with very, very few cities, with no rule of law, with no kings, with very different religious structures. And so there are geographical models which help to solidify why there are differences in these people. There are some geographers who work along the basis of the Ptolemaic system of the 7 climes. So that is that there are 7 climatic zones that you can divide the entire world into.
So this is a Greek late antique idea that the Arabs have got hold of here.
Yes, and it's adjusted and adapted somewhat, but the notion behind it is that certain climes, because of the differences of the climate and the effect that that then has on the 4 humours, that alters one's ability to rule or to conduct oneself in a certain manner. And so it means that they might expect people of the north, for instance, to be somewhat less civilised or somewhat less able to deal with a rule of law because they're living in such a cold climate, and that has a physical impact on them. This
so
is
a
not
climb here is, it's almost, we could imagine a band drawn across a map of the world almost, right? And you've got the northerly ones, the middling ones, and the southerly ones.
Yes, and the middling ones are your ideal, really.
Yeah.
That's
and
where you
coincidentally,
want to be.
that's where you end up living, right? Anybody who draws a climb tends to end up living in the good climb. Right?
Yes. So this isn't completely prescriptive. It's not a case of every geographer sitting and thinking in this way. There's a lot of what's being written isn't necessarily being written with a sense of judgment. Nobody is sitting there and saying, well, I have a story to tell you about these absolute savages and how terrible they are. They present this information quite neutrally for the most part. There's the occasional eyewitness who might react somewhat excitedly or in a horrified manner in response to some of the material that they see, but even where the geographers are having to moderate their own absolute surprise and astonishment at the things that they're hearing, they're not necessarily casting these aspersions, these labels of barbaric and primitive. And I think that's where we have to think, and I say we as European medievalists dealing with this source material, that's where we have to think about the reactions of especially people who identify themselves with the medieval peoples described as savages in these sources, and what kind of emotive impact that has on people. An awful lot of the complaints from this source material that suggests that it's some kind of bias, some Muslim bias against white Europeans, for instance, comes from the basis that if the white Europeans are being described as filthy and unhygienic and not the most civilized and organized, that's an implicit criticism of these people against the Caliphate.
What you're imagining there, what you're talking about, you don't have to imagine it because it's real, of course, but what we're talking about is somebody in Scandinavia or Russia, for example, today, reading one of these accounts and feeling, oh, why are you saying that about, the Rus? Why are you saying they're so dirty, and not feeling very good about it, right?
Yes.
Well, let's put that to one side for the moment, if we can, because I just want to get a few more pieces on the board. We're using this term sort of geographers, but can you tell us a bit more about the kind of person in the Caliphate who's interested in this stuff, who's interested in faraway peoples? Who is it who's writing this stuff? What kind of person is it who's writing this stuff down? Any examples, perhaps? Or...
Okay, yeah, absolutely. I use geographer to cover all manner of situations here. The reality is a lot more complex. We're not just looking at people writing geographical works. We're looking at medieval chroniclers who are charting major historical events across certain years, who then encounter the Rus, for instance, when they are a raiding and an invading and occupying force in various regions, both in Al-Andalus in the west and in what's now Azerbaijan in the east.
So sometimes it's a chronicler, sometimes it's a geographer. We're using the word geographer a bit elastically here.
And even with geographers, you have very different geographical approaches. You have some geographers who write encyclopedic works, so people such as Ibn Rushd in the early 10th century or Yaqut al-Hamawi in the 13th century. They write very systematic geographical works. In Ibn Rushd's case, he takes a climatic structure, really, and we only have one volume of his work surviving, which is fortunately the one that deals with the Rus, and he organises his geographical encyclopedia according to geographical area. Whereas Yaqut, what he does with his dictionary of countries is he organises all of his countries, all of his regions, all of his rivers alphabetically.
So talking about, say, Ibn Rushd, for example, what I'm trying to get at is what sort of person is this? Should I be imagining a sort of portly gentleman, perhaps not totally dissimilar to myself in some ways, who doesn't really go out there and see the world very much, but sits there in the library, gathers as much stuff and just finds it all terribly interesting? Should I be imagining a cold-blooded bureaucrat who wants to make sure that we've got the right information because it's essentially a form of intelligence on faraway peoples? Should I be thinking of eyewitness accounts, travellers, explorers going out there and meeting these sorts of people? What should I be imagining?
You should absolutely be imagining all of those things, really. Okay. In Ibn Rushd's case, we're looking, in essence, at an armchair geographer or an armchair historian who...
Sounds great.
Yeah, there have previously been theories that he did travel, but at this point in time, we really don't think that he really went much further than from Isfahan to Mecca. If that far at all.
I don't like travelling. I think that's good.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a benefit in sitting home and doing this sort of thing. And with the literary and the academic culture that was flourishing at the time, it was easy enough to do that, to access other people's work. Other geographers did travel. So Yaqut, for instance, he sometimes corroborates or comments on things that he's worked with from other geographers or other eyewitnesses, where he can say, oh, well, I know this to be true because I experienced this when I went to this place. Then we do also have spy masters compiling postal routes for the sake of intelligence, gathering information. This is Ibn Khurad Bey in the 9th century, who he was both a spy master and a postmaster. And so he compiled a huge work full of routes that were taken by various traders and so on and so forth. And that contains all these little snippets of, in essence, intelligence, the kind of thing that's important to spies. And then equally, we have eyewitness accounts. We have people like Ahmed ibn Fadlan, who travelled from Baghdad to the Volga River in 921 AD, predominantly to visit the Volga Bulgars, but whilst he was there, he encountered the Rus, and his eyewitness account survives in a few different forms. We have a traveller from Al-Andalus, Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, who travels across continental Europe. He goes to Scandinavia, he goes to Eastern Europe and gets all over the place later in the 10th century. So we have this real range of people. When we talk about geographers, it's not just people writing encyclopedias or people compiling accounts of all of the wonders of the world and all of the miraculous and marvellous things and all of the monsters. It's also people writing chronicles, or it's people who are eyewitnesses, or people gathering information for various reasons.
Excellent. So I think we know a bit about one side of the equation, right? We know about the kind of people who, in the Caliphate, who are writing this material. I want to look at the other side of the equation now. Can we say something about the people who are being written about? Who are these? I'm calling them sort of tribes. I'm aware that's not quite the right word here. Now, we've got the Rus, but we're going to get to them specially in a minute. But who else was of interest? What sort of non-Muslim peoples what categories were they interested in, the chroniclers? The geographers, I should say.
Yeah, well, anyone and everyone, really. Anywhere where they had an awareness that there was a population. Obviously, there were specific interests and concerns, not just from a geographical sense, but also with a view to military issues, with political issues, with slave trading issues, with adjacent populations. So Byzantium was of huge interest for various political and cultural reasons.
So that's one sort of type one non-Muslim type that gets written about is the Byzantine or the Greek. This is Rum in Arabic?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, that's one type.
Yes, and there's also an interest in India as a close-by region, somewhere that was traded with. There's significant interest in peoples living across Africa, West Africa particularly. But
and that's sub-Saharan West Africa as well, right?
Yes. And across the continent, as far as people were able to travel and gather information, there's an interest. People are writing. There are discussions of China and trade with China, travel accounts looking at that area of the world. And then there's Europe. We see that not just with the discussions of the Rus and the people on the Eurasian steppe, but also the Franks, as they're understood to be. And that obviously really flourishes with literature surrounding the Crusades and the cultural interactions that occurred there. But even before that, there's these understandings of the regions that exist in that part of the world, even as far as Britain and further north.
There's this Arabic word, ifranj. Can you say something about that?
That is, in essence, Frank.
And it sounds like they're a bit broader with it, I mean, than the European Christian might be. So I imagine that the average person living in England in the year 900 were not very happy to be being called a Frank. But they're a bit looser with the idea of a Frank.
Yes, it's a generalisation, a term that essentially means European, and so it's applied fairly broad brush to people from that part of the world at the time.
Is there a sense, and do tell me if I'm wrong about this or how wrong I am, is there a sense that some of these foreign peoples, Rum, a Byzantine or something like it, Ifranj, the Franks, possibly the peoples of India as well. I think that's Al-Hind, isn't it?
Yes.
But they're people that the Caliphate, they might have some strange ideas, but they're people the Caliphate can sort of get on with in one way or another. And then you've got the people who are a bit weirder, if you like, to the eyes of the Caliphate. There you've got things like Sakaliba, right? I mean, something like a Slav. I mean, they get mixed up. But Rus, obviously, possibly the peoples of West Africa as well. That's not a fair characterization.
We're treading on dangerous ground with generalizations.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, is it as a generalization? Is it a wrong generalization, or can we say, you know what, Richard? There's lots of examples where that's absolutely not the case. Lots of exceptions, but as a general tendency, that division of yours is right.
I think one of the key criteria for how geographers felt about others kind of boiled down to religion. This wasn't by any means the only metric that was being used. It wasn't the only point of concern. There were military issues, political issues, cultural issues. There's also the question of how far away a distant people are. Are they enough of a threat that they could be a military threat, that they could threaten one's culture? Or are they just far enough and distant enough away that they can be a curiosity in a geographical text without really threatening anything? So Christians, Jews, people who followed Abrahamic religions.
Al-Kitab concept,
yes,
people of the book.
Exactly. They at least had enough of a correlating religious practice or religious culture.
You can do business with them. They can be a part of the Caliphate as long as they accept Muslim supremacy, right? There's sort of
yes.
Al-Kitab that's not a terrible thing to be in Muslim eyes.
It's
right?
really not legally, and from a tax perspective.
Yeah.
It is very helpful to be a person of the book if you're operating within the Caliphate. And we actually see this in relation to the Rus at a point in time when the Rus were still pagan. So Ibn Khordadbeh, this spy master who collected intelligence and information on various people and the trade routes that they took, he explains that he is well aware that the Rus, when they on occasion traded as far as Baghdad directly, pretended to be Christian in order to pay the jizya, the poll tax, in the same way that Christians did, because that provided them with favourable conditions. It didn't come with any pressure to convert to Islam. So Ibn Khaldun is aware that the Rus are doing it, but equally the Rus are aware that this is something that they need to do, that they need to put on a very convincing pretense of Christianity whilst they're in the city of Baghdad, whilst they're trading within the Caliphate, in order to get these ideal conditions for trade.
Well, at this point, the Rus are really banging on the door, so I think we better let them in. Can you give us a short overview? Who are the Rus? Who were the Rus?
That really depends on who you ask. And that's a huge part of the problem when we're studying this area. The Rus, most simply, are, for me, they were a people who were living in what we now see as Ukraine and Russia between the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, effectively. We see quite strong cultural parallels with Scandinavia during the Viking Age.
Often personal names, right? Often personal names are basically Scandinavian names.
Yes, absolutely. And the reason for this is that Scandinavians, Vikings, traded eastwards via the river routes in Ukraine and Russia towards Byzantium, towards the Caliphate. And many of them settled and established trading towns and trading sites along the way. This is not to say that the Rus are purely Scandinavian in the sense that anyone can be purely anything. It's a process of immigration and the creation of a new people, a new population, in essence. So what we see in the Rus isn't just Scandinavian cultural hallmarks, it's also Slavic hallmarks, it's Turkic cultural parallels. And so these people, we can't really define them simply as Vikings, but quite often when they're studied, they are understood either as Vikings or as Slavs, depending on who you ask. For the Arab geographers, they were a people living in the far north, generally adjacent to the Sokolaba, who we see today as Slavs, but that's not an entirely perfect translation of that term. So sometimes they're described as a people of the Sokolaba, as a people of the Slavs. Sometimes they're described as a people of the Turks. It really depends on who you ask amongst the geographers and at what point in time you're doing the asking. But really, they're understood as a population who are important from a trading perspective. When the Rus are discussed, there's quite often talk of the slave trading networks that they're involved in, the fur trade, the swords that they make and sell, and their position as trading intermediaries.
We're talking about their political organisation is obviously complicated and it changes over time. In time, they become a Christian principality, and later on that's going to lead us to Kievan Rus and to a very torturous series of historical mutations, eventually with the problems that the world is seeing today. But I want to stop a little bit before then, if I can. I mean, when they turn up in one Western European source, the Annales Bertiniani, the Annals of St. Bertin, which are Frankish annals, there it seems to be they have a Khagan, right? They have a Turkic Khan, essentially, as their leader. Right? So
yes, they do. And there are other sources as well that talk about that kind of political organisation. There are others that simply say that the Rus have a king or a lord of some kind. There are still others that suggest that the Rus had no king, no laws, or that the Rus were actually three different tribes, three different types. And we don't get very many actionable details on these three different types. A lot of scholars have spilled a lot of ink trying to figure out where these three types of Rus would be based on the basis of cities that exist today. But one of these types, we're told, are so insular, so exclusionary towards outsiders that they kill any strangers who enter into their lands. And so obviously there's not very much known about that type of Rus.
Can we say something about the etymology of this word, Rus? When I sort of say it with my English accent, Rus, it sort of sounds a bit bizarre, but where does that come from? Do we know?
Again, that's a very complicated question, and it's...
By which we mean it's got a question with a lot of answers.
Yes, it's one of the questions that's been at the heart of what we call the Normanist controversy since the 1750s. And so it's quite a tense question.
So the Normanist controversy is this debate over should we understand the Rus as essentially Scandinavian or are they essentially Slavic? Right?
Yes, it's a very polarizing debate, especially because it's so often been seen very much as an either or, that you either need to be able to identify the Rus entirely as Viking or you need to identify them as entirely as Slavic. And it's the kind of debate that is important to Putin right now, but it's also a debate that Adolf Hitler has weighed in on because it boils down to issues of racial supremacy and ethnic supremacy, essentially.
Right. If the people who kick Russia off essentially have some sort of Germanic element, that's obviously a very exciting thought for some people and a very horrifying thought for others. I mean, I'm thinking about things like with the etymology of Rus, there is this idea that it might come from Roslagen, right, in the region of Sweden. Listeners can't see this, but Tanisha's giving me a bit of a look there to say that she doesn't find that totally convincing. Certainly, if you look at the Finnish or the Estonian words for Swedish people, right, you've got Ruotsi in Finnish and Ruotsi in Estonian. It seems, though, that people living east of Sweden tended to think that the people from Sweden should be referred to something like Rus. Is that fair to say?
Yes, these are definitely among the theories for where the term comes from. It's not something that I work with in particular detail, to be honest, because there are many theories on where this terminology is coming from.
And we're never going to be able to know, of course.
No. For my purposes, working with the Arab geographers, I deal with what terms are being used in Arabic and then later in Persian and Ottoman Turkish. And in these sources, what we get al-Rus, the Rus, or we get al-Rusiya. Very occasionally, we're told that they could also be Rus with a short vowel rather than Rus, but they're fairly consistent in offering up the Rus.
And in Greek, right, it's Ros as well in Byzantine Greek. And so lots of people seem to have had some word like this to refer to this type of people, however we think of that type of person.
Yes, absolutely. There's a couple of geographers who try to theorize the idea of a connection between the Rus and the Scandinavians. But that connection isn't so much a question of cultural similarities and identifying parallels that way, as it is a question of thinking about the Scandinavians who are raiding the coast of Al-Andalus versus the Rus who are harrying the coasts of Azerbaijan, and thinking about how, there's this one great seafaring people in the east who are becoming a bit of a scourge, and there's also this people in the west who are doing similar, and God only knows, but maybe somewhere up there's some kind of connection, and that's how they're getting the boats round, and these are the same people or are closely connected people, but nobody's 100% sure, and it's only a couple of people who are forwarding this theory that maybe there's a connection that way. Otherwise, the geographers that I work with certainly aren't sitting there and saying, well, we have an eyewitness account of a Rus funeral, and we know that that's exactly like what the Vikings in Scandinavia did.
Right. I mean, you're preempting my next question here, really, which is, it's clear that modern historians, people like you and I, although you've actually done a lot to get us away from this, so I don't want to necessarily tar you with this brush, but people like us have had a special interest in the Rus because of their apparently Viking connections. And we've spent quite a lot of time, here the we is possibly excluding you here, Tanisha, but modern historians spend a lot of time sort of chiseling the Rus out from the other various groups that get talked about by medieval Islamic sources. But were they actually viewed particularly differently by Arabs in the Caliphate, in the early medieval Caliphate, compared to other non-Islamic groups? Do the Rus have a place that the Sakaliba, for example, don't have?
That's an interesting question. It's one that may well come as a bit of a disappointment to the Viking historians who use this material, because you are right, a lot of this source material circulates so widely in Anglophone European research contexts because it can be identified as Viking. And so it's this way of opening up the Viking Age to the global Middle Ages and saying, hey, look, the Vikings interacted with Muslims from time to time. And it really blows that whole era really wide open in terms of the global connections. there are actually a lot of similarities between, say, the Rus and the Sokolaba, to the extent that sometimes the Rus and Sokolaba are just described as one collective. Geographers will say, oh yes, and then there's the Rus and the Sokolaba, and they do this, and this is how they bury their dead. And so what you see, especially if you look at certain cultural characteristics that geographers like to focus on, things like religion and attitudes towards burial practices, how funerals take place, is that there's an awful lot of overlap and an awful lot of similarities between the Rus and the Sokolaba. Sometimes if a geographer really wants to prove that he's got a handle on the different peoples of the north and wants them to all be distinguished from each other so that you can really draw firm cultural lines between them, he might say, oh, well, the Rus burn their dead, or the Rus bury their dead, and the Sokolaba, they burn their dead. And that's the difference between them. And it's a way of distinguishing between these peoples of the north so that you're not just saying, oh, and then there's this huge nondescript mass of peoples that all do the same thing. It's about being able to narrow down and say, oh, there's these individual peoples and these are the different things that they do and the different things they believe. So, but there are, at the end of the day, an awful lot of similarities, as we might expect from a historical perspective. But the Rus aren't really being picked out by anyone and made the centre of attention. And I think that's something that we are misled about as scholars working on the Viking Age, especially scholars who don't have Arabic working on the Viking Age. When we're presented with information on the Rus from Arabic geographical accounts, there's this tendency to think, oh, well, the Rus must be really important if this geographer's gone to all of the trouble of writing 2 or 3 paragraphs.
And it feels like there's a lot of it. Right? If you read a compendium of these sources, you feel like, wow, there's loads of medieval Arabic writing about the Rus.
Yes, especially when you consider that the most widely available compendia today in English only have a tiny fraction of the material that survives in Arabic. So there's even more to go on. But what we have to understand is that these sources are actually absolutely massive. We're looking at 2 or 3 paragraphs on the Rus in a work that spans 7 volumes.
Right.
The Rus are just one people. They're not the centre of attention. They're not the focal point of these works in a way that we sometimes assume they are, because all we've got is a tiny extract from the source with none of the context about where this source comes from.
That seems a very important point to me, that yes, in absolute terms, seems like there's quite a lot of writing about the Rus, but that's because actually there's an unfathomably large amount of writing about everything. Some of the stuff that this is being cut out of, it's encyclopedias, medieval Islamic encyclopedias, right? So,
yes, and it's an issue that I've discussed with other scholars, that we can come together and talk about what, for instance, Yakut says about the Rus. And they'll say to me, oh, well,
Can we just quickly put a date and place on Yakut, roughly?
Yeah, so I have scholars who'll talk to me about what Yakut is saying about the Rus in the 13th century. And they'll say, well, I didn't know he was saying that about the Rus, but I work with him on this other geographical area. And the problem is that even people who can work with the Arabic text, to sit down and go through all 7 volumes to have an awareness of what he says about absolutely everyone, it can be quite time consuming. And so even the specialists in the Arabic material aren't necessarily working with the entirety of every single text. And it's the kind of thing that when you approach it as a translation project, that's absolutely insurmountable. People aren't going to fund that many volumes of one text.
That is never going to happen, yeah. And that's a sad thing, I think. As the early Middle Ages gives way to the High Middle Ages, in sort of the run of the 1000s and the 1100s, it seems to me that what had once been the massive cultural gravity of the Caliphate does start to wane a little bit. And for example, I started this podcast talking about our Christian chronicler who forgot the Pope, essentially, and his congregation forgets the Pope. Well, actually, that very same chronicle, written by a continuator, they start to remember the Pope again. They get information back around somewhere in the later 1000s and into the 1100s. So the sort of mesmerizing cultural gravity of the Caliphate, it seems to me, does start to diminish as we go from the early Middle Ages to the High Middle Ages. Does writing about the Rus change or go in new directions as we go from early to High Middle Ages?
It absolutely does. And part of this has to do with who the Rus are understood to be and what contemporary information is available to people writing at different points in time and people writing from different parts of the Islamic world, whether they're writing from, say, Bukhara or whether they're writing from Syria.
So Bukhara is in the northwest of what today is Iran, I think. Yeah. And then you've got Syria, obviously a bit further west, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just, for the listeners, I'm just putting this stuff on the table. Keep going, Tonicha. Yeah.
And so we do see these splits in material. So the Rus Christianize, the Rus convert to Christianity, and that obviously changes the material and the ideas that are to be discussed.
Al-Kitab, right? Now they're people of the book.
Yes, but the really juicy bit is knowing what they did before they were Christians. And so you see this hangover that lasts for quite a long time, a number of centuries, where geographers and historians still really want to discuss the Rus in the context of this quite gripping, horrifying stuff that they've read in the older texts.
Human sacrifice,
funerary burning, all of these ideas that really unsettle them about the Rus. They still want to keep hold of that, whilst also proving their chops as geographers and saying, well, of course, everybody knows that the Rus are Christian now. And so they try and retain these bits and pieces, but then we also see the development of ideas and things moving along, talking about the Rus conversion to Christianity, then talking about a Rus conversion to Islam.
Yeah, can we say a bit more about this? So this is someone called Mawazi, writing around 1130?
Yes, that's correct. Mawazi works with material that we recognise from earlier geographers, and that's maybe an important demonstration of how this material is being transmitted and forwarded. So he's within what we would call the Jayani geographical school. And that's not to say that there's a bricks and mortar academy somewhere where people are being sat down and trained in this specific geographical method. What this is that we see several geographers over a number of centuries writing in Arabic and Persian and Ottoman Turkish, who all have the same basic facts about various peoples across the globe, across their geographical target areas. And so Mawazi, we actually see information that we can trace back at least as far as Ibn Rushd in the 10th century. And he's writing 200 years later. And so he's starting to develop things, and we see a bit of a divergence in the tradition with him. So he takes an anecdote that we have in Ibn Rushd, which explains that the Rus don't offer their sons an inheritance, that sons, when they're born, they're presented with a sword and told, your father won his property with the sword. That's what you've got to do too. You're not going to get an inheritance. And he builds on this. It's an idea that a lot of geographers really like because it is quite a jarring idea. It plays into the military threat of the Rus, even if they're incredibly distant people. Children are a very emotive topic when you're thinking about how other people raise their children. And so it's already persisted for quite a long time. And Mawazi thinks about it and he's like, well, if sons don't inherit, then daughters must inherit. But he's also writing at a point in time where the Rus are no longer pagan. And so he has to explain, well, this is what the Rus did until they converted to Christianity. But then they didn't like Christianity very much because they couldn't fight. So they converted to Islam, and that way they could take their swords up for a justified and a moral purpose again.
And that's it. So it's a heck of a thing to say, isn't it? We'll try and get our chops around that if we can. I mean, first of all, the idea that because you've converted to Christianity in the Middle Ages, you can't go out and plunder anymore, that seems far-fetched, to say the least. I mean, medieval Christians didn't have any problem.
Famously crusaded for
exactly.
the sake of being able to plunder legitimately.
Well, right. I mean, it happens outside of the religion, but I mean, Christians attack each other. The story of the Middle Ages is Christians attacking each other and then occasionally attacking some other people. So I find that a bit hard to swallow from Mawazi, the idea that sort of Christianity was too peaceable for them. Or am I thinking about it in the wrong way? Do we think he's telling the truth is what I'm trying to get? Do we think that there was some schism of the Rus who went off and became Muslims?
There are allusions to the Rus being Muslim, or at least some of the Rus being Muslim. Across time, we have other texts that talk about the Rus who have converted to Islam missing pork once they've converted. And so I don't know necessarily that we're thinking of a whole-scale conversion of the Rus, but certainly there seems to be an awareness that at least some of the Rus have converted, and that's not really surprising when you think about the religious landscape that they're in. One of the people on the steppe that the Rus interact with are the Bulgars. And the eyewitness account of the Rus that we have from Ahmed ibn Fadlan in the 10th century came about because a party had been sent to the north to aid the king of the Bulgars in his conversion to Islam. And so the Rus are certainly exposed to Islam as a religion. They're trading with Muslims. They are raiding and occupying Muslim areas. There's nothing to say that it would be unusual for a sizable number of Rus to choose to convert to Islam. Not to mention that when we look towards European and Russian sources on the history of conversion in this area, the story that's famously told is of King Vladimir sending envoys to solicit representatives from all of the major religions and interviewing them and considering which religion he would most like to adopt as his official religion.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very strange motif, that one, because it comes up in lots of sources about lots of different people. There's a similar story about the Khazars, who are a Jewish Turkic group, and they're supposed to also have envoys from every religion to decide which one is best. And it also comes up in Abelard's Collationis, where Abelard has a dream and representatives of different religions turn up and argue which one is best. There's something going on there, although we're never going to work out what it is. We're certainly not work out what it is today on the pod.
No.
So
you see, I think the best solution is the one that a people some distance away from the Rus took. This was the Khaitak or the Khaitan, and they are discussed in some of these geographical sources, Ibn Rusta, for instance, in the 10th century. And they hedge their bets. They've been told by Christians that Christianity is the one true religion. They've been told the same thing by Jews. They've been told the same thing by Muslims. And so on a Friday, they practice Islam. On a Saturday, they practice Judaism. And on a Sunday, they are Christians because their king says, well, everybody says that their religion's the correct one. So if we just go along with all of them, we're sure to get it right somehow.
That's a fantastic anecdote. We're getting towards the end of our time here. I want to ask you quite a broad question here. I'm not sure whether it's necessarily a fair question, but to what extent has interest in the Rus and in these texts about them continued in the Islamic world after the medieval period, after the Caliphate? Are there people today who, in the Arab world, if you ask them about the Rus, they have some vague inkling about what that might mean?
Certainly, these texts are still studied at universities and so on and so forth.
In the Islamic world?
Yes, in various places. I know that Ibn Fadlan, for instance, is taught in Algeria, albeit occasionally a student might raise a concern that Ibn Fadlan is clearly not praying when he's supposed to be praying because he's describing events happening, pagan human sacrifice happening at a time when he should be at prayer. That's how he's explaining what time of day things are happening.
A colleague from Algeria told you that a student had raised this concern.
Yes. And so there are interests at university level. These texts are studied, not always specifically for the Rus, and maybe that's sometimes for the best because I think we get a bit blinkered sometimes in Viking studies with the way that we study these texts and we just pick out the Rus. So these geographers are sometimes studied a bit more holistically. Yes,
I've noticed, we're recording here in Denmark. And here in Denmark, lots of students, even at sixth form level, so sort of late high school level for international listeners, will read in Danish translation just the bit of Ibn Fadlan that's about the Rus. It was sort of cut out and made into a little blue pocket edition, and it was actually published here in Aarhus, funnily enough, in the 80s, I think, 88 maybe. It's taught in lots of gymnasia, lots of sixth form colleges here. Many years ago, I had a job interview in Turkey, and I had to do a job talk. I had to teach the students, essentially, for a couple of hours as part of my selection process. And that was the other place I'd been to, apart from Denmark, where students in the classroom already had read Ibn Fadlan. But when they were reading Ibn Fadlan, they were reading him about the Turks. Right?
Exactly.
Because actually, most of what Ibn Fadlan writes about is the Turks. And the Rus are a sort of funny little side quest, if you like, for him. So both Denmark and Turkey are places where Ibn Fadlan is still being taught.
Absolutely. And he does have some broader cultural influence as well, if we're to look at Ibn Fadlan specifically as an entire travel account, as opposed to the huge selection of sources that talk about the Rus either in a single sentence or in a couple of paragraphs. Ibn Fadlan, so in the aftermath of the Jyllands-Posten controversy here in Denmark and the cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, a Syrian TV network aired a Ramadan TV drama called Roof of the World, which was a 30 1-hour-long episodes, which involved a dramatisation of Ibn Fadlan's journey to the Rus, which was conducted largely to demonstrate that cultural links between the Arab world and Scandinavia, broadly speaking, had always existed. So what was the problem now with these cartoons being published specifically to inflame?
And that series, The Roof of the World, the Syrian TV series from after the crisis, does it do a similar thing? And that scholars often do the thing that you've been critical about, just plucking the Rus out of what is otherwise source material that's got a lot of other things in it?
No, because they render the entire journey. They have 30 hours worth of footage, not exclusively on the journey, but they do the entire thing because it's dramatic, As Viking historians, we sit there and, we're like, well, where's the funeral? We want the human sacrifice. But to think about the rest of the journey, even just the political machinations and the scheming, Ibn Fadlan isn't just one man travelling towards the north. He's part of this huge embassy, essentially, that's travelling north, except they've got political issues with the people they meet, with the money that they're supposed to be carrying not materializing. So there's a lot of conspiracy involved as well. So there's so much additional stuff, so much additional meat that you can really dig into with this text when you're thinking about the wider issues and how it then plays out as a dramatic text without it just being a case of getting Ibn Fadlan to the Rus as fast as humanly possible.
So we've got serious continuity here, or at least a very long lifespan for thinking about these kinds of texts. They've been big in Europe and they continue to be big in the Islamic world.
Yeah, really, there's not that much of a break at all in thinking about these texts, because we see this material spreading in Arabic initially, but also in Persian. There's simultaneously the development of Persian literary geographical cultures in terms of writing in that language from within the Caliphate, from adjacent to. But then the same ideas are being translated into Ottoman Turkish within the Ottoman Empire, and they kind of die out as the geographers and the chroniclers are starting to think, well, actually, we need to put Russia in Europe and talk about Muscovy rather than the Rus. But we still have certain ideas surviving as late as the 1600s in Islamic languages, and that is also kind of the point where you start to see Europeans and European Orientalists really starting to take an interest in acquiring Oriental manuscripts, as it were, and collecting them and stealing them and buying them in huge numbers and bringing them back to Europe and starting to study them. So it's then only a couple of hundred years until European researchers start digging into people like Ibn Fadlan and reading these accounts of the Rus. So there is this real continuity since the 9th and 10th centuries when these people first started being discussed in geographical texts.
And in a curious twist of fate, one of the manuscripts of Ibn Fadlan ends up here in Denmark, doesn't it?
Yes, actually, the very first manuscript used to identify Ibn Fadlan in Europe is one that's housed in Copenhagen. It was purchased in the 1760s in Constantinople by a Danish royal expedition. And in 1814, a researcher named Jens Lassen Rasmussen uses it to unveil Ibn Fadlan to the world, in effect.
And right from the get-go, he's describing the Rus as Scandinavians, right?
Yes, he actually says in the Danish translation that he produces in 1814, he says, well, we're going to hold ourselves back here. We're not going to say anything about the contents of this text I've just translated because we're going to leave that to the Nordic antiquarians. And so it's right away, it's pitched in a very Norse, a very Viking context. And within a decade, people have started translating it, including this guy, with an understanding that when the Rus talk about paradise during a funeral, they are talking about Valhalla. And so we see right away this imposition of Viking ideas right on the top of the Arabic material.
Never uses a word anything like Valhalla.
Oh no, it never uses Valhalla. This is a completely different people. We have no idea if that's what they meant by the afterlife or paradise.
I'm going to ask you a final question to round us off. Where do you think the study of Islamic depictions of the Rus and other non-Muslim groups who are on the fringes of the Caliphate, where do you think it will be in the next century as the decades go on? Is it something that will stay as something primarily Arabists study? Do you think Viking studies will continue working away at it, albeit always in translation, because most people in Viking studies don't have Arabic? Will it become a field in its own right? What do you think the future holds?
I would like to see it become an expanded field. It's complicated because there are so many different routes that it could go. As I've been saying, there are more sources than we see in the most widely accessible translations. And it would be great to see those, but it's also about the priorities of researchers. And a lot of researchers come to these sources looking for actionable information, as it were. They're looking for things that they can then apply and say, well, that's exactly how it is in the archaeology, and that matches up with evidence from other bodies of sources, and this proves what we know about this historical aspect. And so they want the earliest possible material that's contemporary to the Rus. They don't want the more fantastical stuff where we start talking about, say, cannibalism hundreds of years later, and the Rus have become slightly monstrous or just slightly wacky. But I think there's an awful lot to be said for looking at how the ideas have changed and shifted over time, how different compositions of geographical information turn out, not just looking for the earliest texts, digging into what individual manuscript variations say. So I think there's an awful lot that can be done just expanding the available body of sources and thinking about how the Rus are understood, just for the sake of thinking about how the Rus are understood, not as a tick box exercise of saying, well, the Arabs got this wrong about the Rus, didn't they? And we know that that's not right, and they didn't understand that because they were working through an interpreter, as though the people complaining about Arab geographers working with an interpreter are not themselves using translated texts. But there's also this question of integrating the Rus back into the Arabic geographical material. So a lot of what I'm working on at the moment is considering how there are parallels between the pagan Rus and pagans in other parts of the world during the Middle Ages, and how,
according to the Arab sources.
Yes, and where parallels are drawn, whether they're made implicit or explicit, what it is that makes one pagan, and whether the Rus really are that special at all.
Tonicha, this has been utterly fascinating. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
The Chronicles was funded by Aarhus Universitets Forskningsfond. Sound production and original music was by Kirsi Tilk of Tilk Sonics. If you're interested in news and events at the Centre, you can visit our website at cas.au.dk/cvm. I've been Richard Cole. Thank you for listening.